Do you believe that from the 1960s all the way into the 1990s, there were R&B legends who opened their eyes in hotel rooms littered with empty liquor bottles, hands shaking so violently they could barely remember their own names? What could be more tragic than death itself, according to reports? Many of them woke up to the same scene every morning: stained walls, sour air, and stacks of unpaid bills staring back at them like accusations. These were the very voices that once hypnotized America, the men who had stood under the blazing stage lights of Detroit, Chicago, Memphis. Yet some of them were said to have drunk themselves to death right there in front of the audience. Others watched their entire careers vanish because they were too intoxicated to read a single sentence of a life-changing contract. And some, it was claimed, drank until they couldn't even remember the face of the sunlight waiting at home for them. What you're about to hear are 21 haunting, unsettling stories about Black R&B legends who spent their lives slowly drowning in alcohol. Who could have imagined that Mr. Excitement himself, the man whose performance of Lonely Teardrops once made crowds erupt, would someday drink so heavily that one night he would completely forget who he was? Jackie Wilson wasn't just an R&B star of the 1960s. He was a force of nature, a storm in human form, a voice powerful enough to shake any stage he touched. But behind all that glory, there was a worn-out heart, sinking deeper each day into a fog he couldn't escape. It was said that it all began when his relentless touring schedule drained him to the core. Throughout 1965, he played show after show, with almost no rest, singing nearly 2 hours every night, then standing in crowded lobbies signing hundreds of photos before climbing back onto the bus to chase the next city. To take the edge off, as he put it, Jackie started sipping a little whiskey every night. But in less than a year, that little quietly grew into half a bottle. By 1967, liquor had become a chain he couldn't break. Fellow performers recalled that Jackie always carried at least 3 bottles of Old Forester hidden in a suitcase beside his immaculate white suit. Before every show, he would knock back glass after glass to get in the mood, then charge out under the lights with bloodshot eyes, his voice somehow still impossibly magnetic, as if his talent refused to surrender, even while his body crumbled. Then came the night of September 12, 1967, a date that felt like a warning written in bold letters. In a New Jersey theater, Jackie was on stage singing Lonely Teardrops, the crowd roaring so loud it seemed ready to tear the roof right off. As he raised his hand to cue the band into the chorus, his legs suddenly buckled. His face turned ghostly pale, and he collapsed hard onto the wooden floor in front of hundreds of stunned fans, who thought it was part of the act until he didn't move. Medics rushed in fighting to bring him back. Tests later showed his blood alcohol level was nearly twice the legal limit. According to people present that night, doctors said that if they had arrived just minutes later, his breathing might have stopped right there under the lights. But even that public collapse, even that brush with death, didn't stop Jackie. As soon as he left the hospital, he slipped back into the same pattern, convinced that, without the drink, he would never again have the courage to walk out onto the stage. The liquor he believed gave him strength was quietly stripping away his memory, his health, and his grip on reality. It was said that many nights later, he sat alone in yet another anonymous hotel room, staring at a photograph of his own son, his hands trembling as he realized he couldn't recall the boy's name. On the night of September 29, 1975, while performing at a charity fundraiser in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, it happened again. Jackie collapsed mid-performance, but this time it wasn't just exhaustion. A massive heart attack slammed him into a deep coma, one that would hold him prisoner for nearly 9 long years. There were no bright lights now, no screaming fans. Just hospital machines and silence. At last, on the morning of January 21, 1984, Mr. Excitement took his final breath. Without an audience, the room quiet except for the hum of medical equipment. And perhaps the habit he once dismissed as mere stress relief had, in the end, destroyed everything: his career, his memory, and the brilliant life he had built with his own hands. If you've ever heard Disco Lady, you probably pictured Johnny Taylor as a studio king, the kind of man who only had to open his mouth and the label would let the money rain down like a waterfall. People imagined his life as one long victory lap, but according to those close to him behind the stage lights, was a fear so relentless he needed a drink just to fall asleep. Starting in the late 1970s, Johnny was said to complain that he couldn't stand the silence in his Texas apartment after each tour. Every wall glittered with gold records, trophies of past glory. But when night fell, all he heard was the ticking of the clock, as if it were whispering, "Someday the audience will forget you." One longtime assistant later recalled Johnny pouring rum into a glass, tilting his head back with a hollow laugh and saying, "At least this stuff never betrays me." That was how the pattern began. At first just a glass of rum, then two, then the whole bottle. By 1976, people in the studio joked that no one could remember the last time he'd recorded a vocal sober. Night after night, he sat at the microphone in a crisp white shirt with a gold chain glinting at his neck, clutching a bottle of rum like it was the only key to unlock his voice. The breaking point came on the night of September 2, 1980. Witnesses said Johnny strode through the lobby of the Statler Hilton in Dallas, his charm turned up to full power. He reportedly reserved an entire floor of suites, hired 3 young women, ordered 6 bottles of Dom Pérignon, 2 bottles of whiskey, and even bought a $20 zero diamond necklace, just to hear his lovers' laughter. In barely 12 hours, he burned through close to $50 zero, more than half of what he had earned from his entire summer tour. The next morning, when he woke in a room filled with stale liquor and discarded glasses, he didn't even have enough cash left to pay the driver who'd waited all night. After that wild spiral, the IRS started sending thick envelopes, penalty notices demanding around $300 zero in back taxes. Friends slowly drifted away, phone calls stopped, and the label suspended all projects, afraid to pour more money into a collapsing life. In his final years, Johnny reportedly lived in a modest Texas apartment with walls plastered in unpaid bills, court summons, and child support demands for 9 children by 7 different women. And in the end, the only thing resting on the table of a legend was said to be a single empty bottle of rum. Someone once said Wilson Pickett's voice was strong enough to tear apart any microphone he held. But even that mighty voice couldn't rescue him from the bourbon that stalked his life. He was the pulse of 1960's soul, the man behind In the Midnight Hour, a song that blasted across American radio every summer. Yet once the lights went out, Pickett wasn't Mr. Midnight anymore. He was just a trembling man searching for something solid to hold on to. People still talk about the night of June 15, 1981, in Englewood, New Jersey, when the air was heavy and hot. Wilson sat in his Cadillac Eldorado, the passenger seat cluttered with plastic cups and empty old granddad bottles. He had already downed more than half a bottle of bourbon, a temporary numbness soaking through his veins. He reportedly sighed, wiped his face, and rasped to his friend, "Tonight, I just need a little peace." But peace never came. Near midnight, his car slammed straight into an old oak tree. The frame crumpled, the windshield shattered glass, exploding like ice under pressure. Police had to pry the bent door open to drag him from the wreckage. His face was bloodied, his clothes torn, the smell of alcohol thick in the air. Tests showed his blood alcohol level at 0.24%, 3 times the legal limit. One officer later recalled that when they lifted him from the driver's seat, Pickett struggled to open his eyes and mumbled, I don't know who I am anymore." After the crash, headlines in New York and Detroit reportedly screamed, "Soul Man commits slow suicide in bourbon." Fellow musicians could barely hide their disappointment. Aretha Franklin was said to have remarked bluntly on television, Wilson didn't need anyone else to destroy him. He did it himself every night. Percy Sledge remembered touring with him in Boston in 1978, watching Pickett drink an entire bottle before going on stage, then walk out like a sleepwalker with bloodshot eyes, his voice so ragged it sounded as if it might shatter on every note. But the accident didn't stop him. If anything, people claimed he drank even more afterward. Each night he sat alone in his small home studio, gripping a trembling glass of bourbon, playing in the midnight hour, over and over again, as if trying to remind himself he had once been a king. By January 2006, his liver was failing. His skin had turned a waxy yellow, his limbs swollen, his strength fading. Doctors reportedly warned that even if he stopped drinking that exact day, he might have only a few weeks left. On the morning of January 19, 2006, he took his final breath in a quiet hospital room in Reston, Virginia. No roaring crowd, no spotlight, just silence. Maybe the night he crashed that car into the tree was the dark punctuation mark at the end of the sentence, a sign that no song would ever be enough to calm his heart, and no amount of bourbon could erase how alone he had become. Next, let's step into the story of Percy Sledge, the voice that once left America breathless with "When a Man Loves a Woman." He was the R&B icon of the South, a man who could take raw pain and spin it into a melody that sounded eternal. But there was one thing Percy never figured out how to do. He never learned how to stop himself from sliding into the deep pit of addiction. Starting in the late 1960s, Percy developed a habit that would quietly stalk him for the rest of his life. Every time he recorded, he would sit in the wood-paneled Muscle Shoals studio with a bottle of wild turkey already waiting on the table, like an old friend. He always poured 3 full glasses with his own hands and tossed them back, without leaving so much as a drop. When people asked why he drank so much, he would give a hollow laugh and say, "Without the booze I sing like I'm dead." But in reality, it was the liquor that was slowly turning him into a kind of singing corpse, alive on stage, dying everywhere else. On the overcast morning of March 17, 1972, Alabama's sky was a dull gray when Percy walked into the studio in a wrinkled brown suit, his clothes and breath heavy with the scent of whiskey. When he stepped up to the microphone, his voice was still beautiful enough to raise goosebumps on every arm in the room. But after only a few lines, something changed. A technician never forgot what happened next. Percy lifted his head, his eyes suddenly vacant, and whispered, Where am I?" Seconds later, he crumpled to the wooden floor, his skull hitting the boards with a sickening crack. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics had to carry him out on a stretcher, his mouth still stained with foamy liquor. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed acute liver failure from alcohol poisoning. They reportedly told those around him that if they had arrived just 10 minutes later, his heart would have stopped. Everyone thought that nearly dying would shock Percy into stopping, that he would finally put the bottle down. But only a few months later, he picked it up again, insisting he needed the drink to survive the pressure, the expectations, the ghosts of his own songs. The years that followed left visible scars. His body was ravaged so badly it became impossible to hide. His hands shook so violently he needed an assistant just to steady them long enough to sign documents. Before one show, Percy was said to have stared into a mirror, then burst into tears at the sight of his swollen face and waxy yellow eyes that once sparkled under stage lights, now dulled by years of liquor. By 2015, liver cancer had drained almost every trace of strength from that legendary singer. Each night he lay alone in his hospital bed, quietly singing the lines that had made his name decades earlier. On the morning of April 14, 2015, Percy Sledge slipped away, leaving behind one bitter question hanging in the air like a final note. If there had been no whiskey, would he have lived long enough to sing just once more? Right after Percy's story, there is another voice, one that roared like a storm and drove itself into a dead end. They called him the Lion of the Blues, the thunderous singer who turned Turn on Your Love Light into an anthem across the American South. But few people knew Bobby Bland once admitted that sobriety scared him more than death itself. It all started quietly in the mid-1950s when he signed his first contract with Duke Records. Friends recalled that even during his very first recording sessions, Bobby poured 2 full glasses of bourbon before stepping up to the mic, joking that his throat refused to sing without liquor. That ritual followed him like a shadow for more than 20 years. The bottle did more than calm his stage fright. It became the excuse he used to hide from everything waiting outside the studio doors, from crushing tax debts to what many described as a doomed affair with a lounge singer named Rosetta. People whispered that Bobby brought Rosetta with him on tours throughout the South, renting 2 hotel rooms side by side so no one would suspect anything. But the endless drunken nights twisted their relationship into something painful. One night, during a vicious argument, Bobby was said to have screamed so loudly and cruelly that Rosetta simply picked up her things and walked out into the darkness, leaving him alone in a room scattered with empty bottles. Everything finally shattered on the morning of September 3, 1974. Bobby was scheduled to leave for a European tour worth around $150, a trip he hoped would revive his declining career and clear some of his debts. But he had knocked back half a bottle of bourbon in just an hour. When his assistant came in to check on him, they reportedly found Bobby slumped on the edge of the bed, his face purple, his eyes wide open, but unable to recognize a single person in the room. He remained unconscious for 36 hours. The entire European tour collapsed. Overnight, the contract gone, the money gone. The label soon announced it would cut all promotional funding, unwilling to risk more on a man whose body was failing him. After that shock, Bobby tried to rebuild. He recorded, he rehearsed, he stepped back onto stages, but the old blaze never returned the way it once had. Some studios refused to book sessions with him because they couldn't stand the constant smell of liquor. Audiences whispered that his voice had cracked, that it no longer carried the same dangerous magic that once made them hold their breath. In his final years, Bobby Bland still took small gigs in shabby clubs, singing for crowds that were a fraction of what they used to be. According to people close to him, he would rather drink and forget everything than stay sober and live with the weight of regret. And in the dim light of those late-night stages, the lion of the blues sometimes looked less like a king and more like a man who had been quietly devoured by the very thing he thought was helping him survive. Solomon Burke wasn't just called the king of rock and soul. He was the towering monarch behind more than 30 Billboard hits that electrified American stages throughout the 1960s. Anyone who met him never forgot the sight: an imposing man weighing over 400 pounds, always wrapped in a flawless suit, silver cane in hand, his smile looking as if nothing in the world could ever break it. But behind that polished grin there was a nightly ritual few people suspected. According to those who worked with him every evening, he drained at least half a bottle of cognac to quiet the noise in his mind. The drink became his shield, his sedative, his invisible crutch. Then came the night of July 12, 1985, a night Memphis would never quite forget, a stain Solomon himself could never wipe away. At an after-show party with cognac fogging his thoughts, he reportedly exploded in a burst of rage when a young assistant had the nerve to argue with him. Witnesses said he hurled a wooden chair so hard it shattered into pieces, then lunged into a brawl that ended with 4 people on their way to the hospital. By the time police arrived, Solomon was staggering on the steps, his face flushed crimson, shouting, "I'm the king here, the consequences were brutal." He ended up paying around $120 to settle lawsuits. Worse than the money, however, were the whispers that began to swirl through the industry. Rumors spread among booking agents that Burke had been caught hiding bottles of liquor in his luggage and demanding cash payments to cover mounting gambling debts. Promoters quietly canceled shows, claiming they were afraid he might not even be steady enough to stand on stage. In his final years, Solomon still performed, but the image was different now. Someone often had to help him up the steps to the stage, guiding him like a fragile monument to his own past. One technician remembered seeing him seated alone in a dressing room, his large hands shaking as he poured cognac into a glass, staring at it as though the liquid might somehow erase his regrets. In 2010, while flying to Amsterdam for yet another show, Solomon Burke died quietly on the plane. He left behind nearly 20 children, millions of dollars in unpaid taxes, and a musical legacy forever entwined with shadows many preferred not to discuss out loud. If soul music were a grand cathedral, Sam Cooke would be the founding father who laid its first stone, with "A Change Is Gonna Come." His voice sounded like hope, like redemption, like the future. But few people knew that on his final night, he was reportedly so drunk he could no longer tell the difference between love and catastrophe. On the night of December 10, 1964, Sam walked out of a Los Angeles studio carrying a half-empty bottle of gin. Most people assumed he was trying to drown a week's worth of stress. His wife had accused him of infidelity, and he had received letters from 3 different women claiming he had fathered their children. Later, when his diary was found, there was said to be a single lonely line written on one page: "They only love me when I'm on stage." Around 2:00 a.m., Sam checked into the Hacienda Motel. Witnesses claimed he was so drunk he couldn't properly fasten his shirt, muttering, "I'm Sam Cookie. I'll love whoever I want." After that, the night dissolved into a haze that still hasn't fully cleared even decades later. Some people said he was ambushed. Others insisted he went into a frenzy, pounding on the manager's door and demanding the young woman who had arrived with him. When police finally arrived, Sam was already lying dead on the floor, bullet through his heart, his blood alcohol level reportedly nearly twice the legal limit. The truth of what really happened that night has never been fully settled. Some conspiracy theories claimed he was killed for the cash in his wallet. Others insisted it was a setup designed to silence him before he could expose a record label scandal. No theory has ever erased the unease. What remains clear is how people remember him: Sam Cooke, the angelic voice that could lift a listener's soul clean out of their body. A man who seemed to save everyone except himself from that final drunken night. And for more than half a century since, whenever his name is spoken, one question still lingers in the air, like an unfinished verse. If he had been sober that night, would the history of soul music look completely different today? Maybe not many young listeners today remember Little Milton, but in the 1960s, he was a fixture at chess records. His guitar seemed to cry like a human voice, and his raw vocals pushed, "We're gonna make it up the charts," turning it into an anthem for anyone who believed poverty could be outrun. Yet behind the reputation of a crossover blues and R&B icon, Milton lived a private life filled with more scars than most people ever guessed. Born in Mississippi, he grew up in hard-edged poverty and long nights when, according to his own accounts, his father came home drunk and smashed whatever his hands could reach. In one old interview, Milton admitted, "I carried that scar my whole life, and bourbon was the only thing that made it stop hurting." That is why, after he found fame, he reportedly insisted that every show had to have a bottle waiting backstage. Many club managers said Little Milton never stepped onto a stage without downing at least 3 bourbons to warm his throat. But many nights, those bourbons didn't just warm him, they erased him. The drink turned into a fog that made him forget where he came from, and worse, where he was heading. Then came the night of September 8, 1990, in Kansas City, a turning point he could never escape. After the final song, he stepped off the wooden stage, his breath thick with the sour smell of liquor, and collapsed face first onto the cold cement floor. An assistant later said that only hours earlier Milton had cashed a $5 zero check to buy Dom Pérignon and bourbon for the entire band, raising his glass with a hollow toast. "Let's drink to this miserable life." The mild stroke that followed nearly killed him. It took almost a year before he could walk steadily again. But the voice that had once silenced entire rooms was now reduced to a rough, broken rasp. Still, he kept pushing himself back under the lights, recording a few final albums, as if he were refusing to admit the end was coming. By 2005, another stroke struck. Little Milton died in a Memphis hospital, leaving behind a towering blues legacy, 7 children from tangled relationships, and an endless trail of regret that seemed to cling to his name. You may have heard, "If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right 100 times." But few know that Luther Ingram's own life became the bitter proof of that lyric. He loved the music, he loved the stage, and according to many who knew him, he loved the bottle so much that he eventually lost sight of what was right or wrong for himself. Luther was born in Tennessee and raised around smoke-stained churches and nights when his parents argued over money that never seemed to be enough. People said he started drinking bourbon at 21st just to steady his nerves before opening sets. But the habit clung to him like a curse. When fame finally arrived, with If Loving You Is Wrong, the endless shows and studio sessions made Luther believe the glass in his hand was a lucky charm, a talisman he needed to face the world. By the early 1980s, his personal life was unraveling right alongside his drinking. It was reported that Luther's wife once left for her mother's house for 2 long months because she couldn't stand hearing him drunkenly call her by an old lover's name at the dinner table. Musicians remembered a show in Mobile, Alabama, where Luther downed 4 bourbons backstage, then stumbled out under the lights and missed his cues for the first 3 songs, leaving the band scrambling to cover the silence. The price for those nights turned out to be far higher than he ever imagined. In 1995, doctors diagnosed him with early-stage cirrhosis. Within weeks, the voice that had once made audiences tremble simply vanished. For 6 months, Luther lay in a hospital bed, his lips dry, sometimes croaking out fragments of words no one could understand. Although he later recovered enough strength to record a few final tracks, that voice never returned completely. When Luther Ingram died in 2007, friends said the real tragedy wasn't loving the wrong person, it was believing that bourbon could drown the loneliness that followed him everywhere he went. Anyone who ever heard Syl Johnson's raspy voice on different strokes remembers the beautiful anguish in every note. But what almost no one saw was the pattern that followed him after each show, a man shuffling back to a small hotel room, pulling the curtains shut, and pouring thick rum, as if he needed to erase himself from the map. In the 1980s, Syl was not just Chicago's soul king, he was a man terrified of disappearing. Some people claimed he was so obsessed with staying visible that he printed stacks of tour posters and plastered them all over the studio walls, just to remind everyone his name still mattered. That same fear drove him to drink until he could forget the bills, the lawsuit threats, the sleepless nights that stretched on forever. On the night of July 14, 1992, what should have been a triumphant London concert turned into a backstage nightmare. Syl had reportedly drained almost an entire bottle of rum from the hotel bar, just to keep his heart from racing. When the last song ended and the applause faded, he stepped off the stairs, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the microphone, then suddenly collapsed on the cold concrete floor. A nurse later said he remained in a deep coma for almost 8 hours, his blood alcohol level so high that medically he should have died right there. The incident didn't just cancel 10 shows and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, it tore open a wound. No doctor could treat the terror of being alone, of being forgotten. Even after Syl woke up, he never truly stopped drinking rum at night. Family members remembered that every time he lifted the glass he whispered, "Just one more sip, then I'll sing like I used to." But the past never came back, and the more he tried to chase it, the further it slipped away. No one will ever forget O.V. Wright, the man who turned the recording studio into a kind of sanctuary where each love song sounded like a confession whispered in a darkened chapel. What people rarely talk about is how he let liquor and drugs carve away his flesh and spirit until almost nothing remained. O.V. never pretended to be untouched by darkness. He grew up without a father, surrounded by poverty, and a childhood as rough as the unpaved road he walked to school. That hunger, first for food, then for something to fill the emptiness, led him toward fiery liquor and eventually harder substances that became his nightly routine. Bandmates said he had a disturbing schedule, shooting up in the morning to get in the mood, then drinking bourbon at night in order to sleep. By 1975, he reportedly owed his label tens of thousands of dollars for missing too many recording sessions. His wife walked out, leaving behind a scrawled note, "You love music more than anything, even yourself." On February 4, 1977, O.V. vanished from his Memphis hotel just before he was supposed to board a tour bus for Texas. Hours later, they found him sprawled on a stairwell, blood soaking his coat. Doctors said he had suffered a gastrointestinal hemorrhage from alcohol, and that the last hit of dope had pushed his body past the breaking point. He survived, but his voice never fully healed. The shows that followed grew fewer and smaller. Crowds thinned until in 1980 O.V. Wright died quietly. His apartment was nearly empty, just some old tape reels and an unfinished bottle of bourbon left behind. Many who knew him believed he drank to punish himself because he never found a way to forgive the choices he'd made. When Billy Paul sang Me and Mrs. Jones, the world thought he was the man who understood love better than anyone. But away from the microphone, he was reportedly a man so exhausted and worn down that he clung to vodka like a life raft. Beginning around 1974, his nights followed almost the same ritual over and over. He would turn off the phone, shut the curtains tight, and pour a full glass of Smirnoff. He liked to say vodka kept the sweet taste of fame alive on his tongue, but in reality, it was the only thing that seemed to dull the emptiness that settled over him after endless fights, with his wife fights about affairs, money, and the children he didn't dare acknowledge publicly. It all came to a breaking point one night in August 1985. Witnesses said Billy wandered through the streets of Philadelphia pounding his fist against taxi hoods, shouting that no one needed him anymore. Police eventually had to restrain him, lifting him off the sidewalk and carrying him to the station while he reeked of alcohol and tears. The next morning, the Philadelphia Inquirer reportedly ran a brutal headline, "Golden Voice, Lost in the Drink." That same night, shaken and ashamed, Billy swore he would quit forever. But when the sun rose, he opened the fridge, reached for the bottle, and quietly filled the glass again like a man replaying the same tragic scene he couldn't escape. If you've ever fallen in love with Phyllis Hyman's voice on "You Know How to Love Me," it's hard to imagine that the same woman spent night after night alone in her New York apartment, staring at a vodka bottle as if it were the last doorway out. In the 1980s, her career was soaring, television appearances, sold-out shows, critical praise. But behind the lights, Phyllis was sliding deeper into loneliness and depression. Every time a tabloid scandal broke, every time she was labeled unstable or difficult, she took another long swallow. Her assistant remembered one night when Phyllis clutched a stack of fan letters, her hands shaking, her voice breaking as she said, "They love my voice, but if they knew the real me, they'd all leave." Vodka quickly became the only sleeping pill that ever worked, the only thing that could mute the noise in her head, long enough for her to close her eyes. On June 31, 1995, Phyllis wrote just a few short words, "I'm tired. I'm sorry." That was the last message from a legend who had given everything on stage and felt she had nothing left off it. When they found her, she was gone. Beside the bed, an empty Smirnoff bottle lay on its side, the final proof of a thirst, not just for liquor, but for love and peace that never truly ended. Then came the drifter with a guitar and a cognac bottle. After Phyllis was gone, Johnny Guitar Watson kept traveling the world, hiding his own loneliness behind blistering riffs and a showman's grin. Everyone who met him was drawn to his swagger and that weathered guitar, but fellow musicians knew a secret: he never toured without a bottle of Hennessy tucked into his old leather bag. Johnny liked to claim that cognac kept his stage fire burning, that it was part of the act. But those closest to him believed it was really covering up something more frightening: the fear of aging, of losing relevance, of waking up one day and discovering that the crowd had moved on. Bandmates said that every night he promised himself, "This glass is the last." But that last glass always turned into 3 or 4 more, the same cycle repeating city after city. During his 1996 Asian tour, doctors reportedly warned him that his liver was nearly destroyed. Johnny just smiled, slung the guitar over his shoulder, and said, "I don't know what sober living is for." On May 17, 1996, the Tokyo Dome glowed under the lights as the audience roared for him one more time. Johnny bent at the waist to bow his trademark move. But this time, his hands started to tremble. The bottle of cognac slipped from his grip, smashed across the stage, shards of glass scattering around his boots. He collapsed beside the microphone, eyes still open, staring into the sea of faces in front of him. The guitar's last notes hadn't even faded from the speakers, but his voice never rose again. It stayed behind on that stage forever, a chilling reminder that no amount of fame can rescue a soul that has given itself completely to the bottle. Tyrone Davis was once the pride of Chicago soul, a voice that could lift whole crowds to their feet, all through the 1970s. His records spun in jukeboxes, his shows packed clubs, and his name carried the glow of pure success. But behind that shine, he was slowly slipping into a terrifying habit, drinking rum to drown a fear he could never quite escape, the fear that one day people would simply stop listening. For nearly 2 decades it was said that not a single night passed without him draining at least half a bottle. The endless touring only made the addiction smarter, more disguised. Tyrone had his staff prepare glass decanters in the dressing room filled with liquor, but labeled holy water so reporters and visitors wouldn't whisper. To outsiders it looked like a quirky joke. To him, it was survival. In the freezing February of 1990, as a new Midwest tour kicked off, Tyrone stepped onto a Cleveland stage, ready to sing that first familiar note. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. His voice locked tight in his throat as if someone had quietly wrapped a fist around his vocal cords. He tried to force a sound, any sound, but could only stagger backward, clutching his neck, while the audience stared in confusion, waiting for a note that never arrived. Paramedics rushed in. Later, they reportedly said his vocal cords were so swollen from alcohol-related toxins, they were close to shutting down entirely. Tyrone was ordered to stay completely silent for 8 weeks. No singing, no talking. Just the sound of his own breathing and the news that dozens of shows had been canceled, his paychecks evaporating one by one. When his voice finally crept back, it no longer carried the sweetness that once made millions fall in love. Tyrone spent his later years haunted by the idea that his own hand, the one that lifted the glass night after night, had destroyed the most precious gift he had ever been given, his voice. People used to call Gene Chandler the Duke of Earl, the man who could turn a single song into a nationwide phenomenon. He wore that title like a crown. But no one imagined that just one drunken night would strip him of that crown almost completely. In May 1972, Gene met with lawyers and record label representatives at the Statler Hilton in Los Angeles. By noon, he had already emptied 2 bottles of bourbon to feel bold enough to negotiate. When the haze was at its thickest, someone slid a nearly 50-page contract in front of him. Without reading a single line, Gene signed his name again and again, the ink drying on what might have been the most expensive mistake of his life. The next morning, when his assistant showed him the document in sober daylight, Gene reportedly went pale. The clauses stated that the label owned all his songwriting and recording rights for life. For more than 20 years, whenever Duke of Earl played on the radio, every cent of royalties flowed into someone else's bank account. Gene was forced to take tiny club dates, singing in narrow bars for small audiences, enduring pitying looks from people who only half recognized him. More than once he was spotted slumped backstage, trembling as he flipped through an empty ledger, whispering that losing everything to one drunken signature was a humiliation he would never wash away. Howard Tate was once the kind of singer critics adored, his trembling soul voice, powerful enough to leave a whole room silent. But behind all that praise, there was a bottomless void he rarely dared to talk about. In 1979, after a show in Detroit, Howard received news that shattered what was left of his stability. His wife had filed for divorce and taken their 2 daughters. He didn't go back to the hotel. Instead, according to reports, he walked into a seedy bar and drank until dawn blurred into daylight. From that night on, he disappeared from the music business. For the next 20 years, Howard drifted through Newark streets like a ghost, sleeping on sidewalks with a plastic bag that held cheap vodka and a few faded family photos. Every morning he shuffled to the soup kitchen to claim a hot meal. Then he would sit alone, knees pulled close, while crowds passed by without recognizing who he once was. Some nights people said they saw him huddled under an awning, shaking as he whispered his ex-wife's name into the cold air. In the fall of 2003, Howard suddenly resurfaced. He told reporters that he had once begged strangers for loose change just to buy another drink, that he honestly believed freezing to death in the street might be easier than staying sober and watching his life collapse. Even when he returned to the stage, he carried himself like a man who had nearly traded both his life and his soul to the bottle and only barely made it back. Close your eyes and picture a winter night in Texas, the blue stage lights cutting through the dark shining on a huge man holding a trembling guitar. That was Freddie King, the Texas Cannonball, a player who could twist a guitar string into a cry no one had heard before. But the audience never saw the bourbon hidden in his suitcase, the private companion he believed he needed, or the music would lose its soul. Since the 1,960 people said that every night before he played, Freddie swallowed a full glass, as if he were swallowing the fear that fame would one day abandon him. By the late 1970s, the cost of that fear was written all over his body. His liver had swollen his skin, had turned an unhealthy dark hue, and every breath he exhaled carried the stale scent of old whiskey. After his final tour in Dallas, Freddie lay in a hospital bed too weak to press a single chord. At just 42, his life was closing like the last verse of a blues song, dazzling, brutal, and painfully short. Someone once said if anyone was born to sing about pain, it was Esther Phillips. She was the small woman who turned "Release Me" into one of the saddest prayers of the 1,960 weaving melodies that were sweet and ragged all at once. But she was also the artist who night after night hid away in the studio with a bottle of vodka in one hand and a vial of morphine in the other. From the age of 14, according to those who knew her, Esther drank to forget the poverty she had grown up in. Later she drank more to erase the memories of cruel love affairs that cut deeper than any critic's words. Once she collapsed backstage at the Hollywood Palladium, blood leaking from an injection mark, mumbling words no one could piece together. By 1984, doctors said her liver was beyond saving, and the voice that once made audiences weep had been reduced to broken, shallow breaths. One August morning, she slipped away, leaving behind a brutal truth. Sometimes the most beautiful songs rise from a heart already being eaten away by liquor and pain. Have you ever listened to My Girl and thought it sounded like pure happiness? Let me tell you about David Ruffin, the man who once stood center stage at Motown, lifting the microphone like he could challenge the whole world, and who then spent his nights terrified of his own shadow. As soon as he left the Temptations, David began drinking cognac to fight the silence that followed him from hotel to hotel. Many nights he reportedly laughed in a bitter way and told his bandmates, "This glass is what keeps me from going insane." But the so-called last glass always turned into one more, and then another. One night it was said that he smashed a mirror in a rage, staring at his own reflection, as if asking why that golden voice couldn't save the man who owned it. And on the morning of May 31, 1991, they found David lying on the floor of a West Philadelphia apartment, still clutching a half-empty glass of cognac. The loneliness he feared most had finally swallowed him whole, leaving behind a legacy, as glorious as it was unbearably tragic. If you've ever loved the blues, you've heard Dinah Washington, the little woman with the big voice who turned every song into a raw confession. But few people realized that behind each glamorous night, there was often an empty bottle of gin waiting in the dark. She survived 7 marriages, 7 chances at peace, 7 descents back into heartbreak. People said she often sat alone in a Detroit hotel suite, gently stroking envelopes from fans while she drank as if the paper letters were the only hands that would never let go of her. On the night of December 13, 1963, Dinah reportedly drank until her hands could no longer hold the glass, her eyelids sinking under a weight no one could name. The next morning, her husband found her motionless, the empty gin bottle rolling quietly on the floor. Maybe that was the only time she was truly silent, and the very last. So now you've heard about 21 R&B legends' voices that once made America fall head over heels in love, who ultimately lost themselves to bitter liquor. Some, like Jackie Wilson, were said to have forgotten the names of their own children. Some, like Sam Cooke, died on nights so chaotic that no one has ever agreed on what truly happened. And others like Billy Paul once swore they would quit drinking only to quietly pour another glass when morning came.